In the gleaming halls of the Galactic Military Academy, where the universe's most elite species gathered to learn the art of war, there walked a figure that drew whispers and pointed claws wherever she went. While her classmates donned their pristine uniforms and polished insignia, she wore something that made even the most battle-hardened instructors pause in recognition: battle-scarred armor. Real armor, dented, scorched, and bearing the unmistakable marks of actual combat. In a place where most students had never seen true warfare, where theoretical knowledge was prized above experience, she was an anomaly that challenged everything they thought they knew about strength, survival, and what it truly meant to be a warrior. They called her crazy. They called her primitive. They called her human. They had no idea they were looking at the most dangerous predator in the galaxy. This is the story of how one human female taught the universe's greatest military minds that sometimes the best lessons come from those who've already walked through hell and lived to tell the tale. The morning sun cast long shadows across the crystalline spires of the Galactic Military Academy as transport ships descended from orbit, carrying the newest batch of cadets to the most prestigious military institution in known space. Representatives from dozens of species stepped onto the gleaming platform, their uniforms crisp, their bearing proud, their futures seemingly assured. Among them walked Sarah Chen, and she looked nothing like the others. Where her fellow cadets wore spotless Academy-issued uniforms, Sarah wore a suit of power armor that had seen better decades. The matte black surface was scarred with laser burns, plasma scoring, and what looked suspiciously like claw marks from some massive predator. The left shoulder blade had been completely replaced, and the slight color difference told its own story of battlefield repairs made under fire. A group of Zolonian cadets, their blue-scaled faces twisted in what passed for amusement among their species, pointed at her with their elongated fingers. Their translator units crackled to life as they spoke in their native tongue, but Sarah's enhanced hearing picked up the universal undertones of mockery. "Look at the primitive human," hissed Zexstar, the apparent leader of their group. His family held significant military rank in the Zolonian Defense Corps, and his arrogance showed in every movement. "Does she think this is some backwater battlefield? This is the Academy. We study theoretical warfare here, not play dress-up in scrap metal." His companions chittered in agreement, their head crests flaring with mirth. The sound drew attention from other species nearby. A cluster of ethereal beings, their translucent forms shimmering in the morning light, drifted closer with the curiosity that defined their species. Several Corvan cadets, massive bear-like creatures standing nearly 3 meters tall. Sarah continued walking, her expression unchanged. The servo motors in her armor hummed quietly as she moved, the sound barely audible above the ambient noise of the spaceport. She'd heard it all before in a dozen different languages on a dozen different worlds. Let 'em laugh. They'd understand soon enough. "Perhaps she cannot afford proper attire," suggested another Zolonian, this one with elaborate scarification marking him as nobility. "I have heard humans come from a poor sector of space. Maybe we should take up a collection to buy her appropriate clothing." The laughter that followed was picked up by more students. Even some of the more reserved species, like the analytical Vorthan with their insectoid features and calculating compound eyes, turned their attention to the oddly dressed human. A few held up recording devices, no doubt planning to share the amusing sight with friends back home. Sarah's armor had been state-of-the-art once, 30 years ago. The Mark VII environmental combat system had been the pride of Earth's military engineers, designed for the harshest conditions the galaxy could throw at human soldiers. It could seal against vacuum, filter toxins, amplify strength, and provide tactical information through its heads-up display. But that was before the frontier wars, before the colonies, before everything changed. Now it bore the scars of genuine combat in ways these Academy students couldn't even imagine. The dent in the chest plate had come from a Hive Queen's stinger on Kepler 442b, a blow that should have killed her but instead had been absorbed by the armor's kinetic dampeners. The scoring along the right arm was from dragging wounded civilians through the acid rain on Vega Prime, while enemy artillery turned the sky into a nightmare of fire and metal. Every mark told a story. Every repair spoke of survival against impossible odds. Every scratch was a lesson learned the hard way, paid for in blood and measured in lives saved. The Academy's orientation hall was a marvel of engineering, its domed ceiling displaying a real-time view of the local star system. Hundreds of cadets filled the amphitheater-style seating, arranged by species and family connections rather than any official protocol. Sarah found herself seated in the back, largely alone except for a nervous-looking human male who kept glancing at her armor with barely concealed awe. "Is that real combat gear?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Actually used in battle?" Sarah nodded once, her attention focused on the stage where Academy officials were beginning to gather. The human beside her introduced himself as Marcus Webb, son of a diplomatic family from the inner colonies. He'd never been further from Earth than Europa, and his excitement at being accepted to the Academy practically radiated from him. "I've read about the Frontier Wars," Marcus continued, clearly struggling to contain his curiosity. "Were you actually there in the fighting?" "Some of it," Sarah replied simply. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the Academy's commandant, General Vexa Hay of the Corvan Star Republic. The massive bear-like alien stood 4 meters tall in full ceremonial armor, his presence commanding immediate attention from every being in the hall. His voice, when he spoke, carried the authority of someone who had led fleets in actual combat rather than just studied it in classrooms. "Cadets of the Galactic Military Academy," he began, his words translated instantly into dozens of languages. "You are here because you represent the finest military minds your species have to offer. Over the next 4 years, you will learn strategy, tactics, leadership, and the art of war itself." Sarah listened with half her attention while her suit's sensors automatically cataloged potential threats and escape routes. Old habits died hard, and the frontier had taught her that survival meant never being completely at ease, even in supposedly safe environments. General Vexai continued his speech, outlining the Academy's proud traditions and impressive graduation rates. He spoke of the great military leaders who had walked these halls, the victories won by Academy graduates, and the peace maintained through strength and superior training. "You will be tested," the Corvan announced, his eyes sweeping across the assembled cadets, not just academically, but physically and mentally. "You will face scenarios designed to push you beyond your limits. Some of you will discover you are not suited for military command. This is not a failure, it is wisdom." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Several of the more sheltered cadets shifted uncomfortably at the implied threat. Sarah remained motionless, her expression unchanged. She'd already been tested in ways these students couldn't imagine. As if sensing her thoughts, General Vexhai's gaze found her in the crowd. For a moment, their eyes met, and something passed between them, a recognition that only came from shared experience with real violence. The Corvan's expression softened almost imperceptibly before he returned to his speech. "Excellence is expected," he continued. "Mediocrity will not be tolerated. Those who graduate from this institution will hold the lives of entire fleets in their hands. They will make decisions that determine the fate of worlds. They will bear responsibility for the safety of trillions of beings across known space." When the orientation concluded, cadets began filtering out toward their dormitory assignments. Sarah stood slowly, her armor's systems performing automatic diagnostics as she moved. Everything was green across the board, just as it had been every day for the past 15 years. "Excuse me," came a voice from behind her. Sarah turned to find herself facing a Vorthan female, her compound eyes reflecting the hall's lighting in complex patterns. The insectoid alien's translator rendered her voice in crisp, precise tones that matched her species' reputation for analytical thinking. "I am Zixara of the Hive Mind Research Collective," the Vorthan introduced herself with a formal bow. "I could not help but notice your equipment. It appears to show signs of actual combat usage. This is unusual for Academy cadets." "Most cadets haven't seen combat," Sarah replied simply. Zixara's head tilted in a way that suggested intense interest. "May I ask where you acquired such experience?" "Our collective would be fascinated to analyze combat data from real engagements." Before Sarah could respond, Zexstar and his group of Zolonian friends approached, their earlier amusement having transformed into something more aggressive. The blue-scaled aliens formed a loose circle around Sarah and Zixisara, their body language suggesting they were spoiling for some kind of confrontation. "Still wearing your costume, human?" Zexstar asked, his translator giving his words an oily quality that perfectly matched his expression. "Perhaps you failed to receive the proper orientation materials. This is an academy, not a scrapyard." "I am beginning to think she cannot afford proper attire," added another Zolonian. "Perhaps her primitive species lacks the industrial capacity to produce suitable uniforms." Sarah studied them for a moment, noting their stances, their positioning, the way they carried themselves. Young, untested, overconfident. She'd seen the type before, usually right before they made mistakes that got people killed. "This armor has served me well," she said calmly. "Served you well doing what?" Zexstar pressed, stepping closer. "Pretending to be a soldier? Playing war games in some human settlement?" Zixara shifted uncomfortably, her species' natural aversion to conflict making itself known. Several other cadets had stopped to watch the confrontation, forming a loose circle of spectators. Marcus Webb hovered at the edge of the crowd, clearly wanting to help but unsure how. "The armor speaks for itself," Sarah replied, her voice carrying no emotion whatsoever. "Yes, it speaks of delusion," Zexstar sneered. "Of a primitive species trying to appear more important than it actually is. Tell me, human, what great battles has your armor seen? What mighty victories can you claim?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Around them, conversation gradually died as more students became aware of the confrontation. Even some of the academy staff had paused to observe, though they made no move to intervene. Such conflicts were considered part of the educational process as long as they remained verbal. Sarah's helmet turned slightly, her enhanced vision noting the positions of every being in the immediate area. 37 students, 4 instructors, 6 security cameras, and 2 automated defense turrets that were currently in standby mode. The tactical analysis was automatic, ingrained so deeply that she barely noticed it happening. "You want to know about the armor's service record?" she asked, her tone still conversational. "Enlighten us," Zexstar said, spreading his arms wide in a gesture his species used to show supremacy. "Tell us about your great human wars. Amuse us with tales of your species' primitive conflicts." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her gaze moving from Zexstar to his companions, then to the growing crowd of spectators. When she finally spoke, her voice carried clearly through the hall's acoustics. "Kepler, 442b, Third Hive War," she began, and several of the older instructors suddenly went very still. "Vega Prime evacuation, the siege of Haven Colony, the Meridian Defense Action, the final assault on Hive Complex Gamma 7. Each name fell into the silence like stones into a still pond. Those were not just battles, they were legends. Stories told in military academies across dozens of species, theoretical case studies of impossible victories against overwhelming odds. Zixara's compound eyes widened as her analytical mind processed the implications. The Vorthan Collective had extensive records of those engagements, and the casualty figures were staggering. The fact that anyone had survived them was remarkable. The fact that this seemingly ordinary human claimed to have been present at all of them was impossible, Zexstar said, but his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. "Those battles, the survivors could be counted on 2 hands. You're lying." Sarah's response was to reach up and activate her armor's external display system. Holographic text appeared in the air around her, scrolling too fast for most beings to read but clearly showing service records, mission logs, and combat citations. The hall fell completely silent. Battle of Kepler. 442, 97% casualty rate among human forces. Mission objective achieved. Colony evacuation successful. Vega Prime, 12-hour running firefight through acid storms. 2,847 civilians evacuated under enemy fire, 0 civilian casualties. Haven Colony, 7-2-day siege against Hive forces. Walls breached 17 times, position held until reinforcements arrived. Meridian defense, Last stand against overwhelming hive assault. Bought time for fleet evacuation. Estimated enemy casualties, 50,000 plus. The records continued scrolling. Each entry a piece of history that had been studied by military strategists across the galaxy. Battles that had been deemed impossible to win, yet somehow had been. Civilians saved against all odds. Last stands that had actually succeeded. And through it all, one name appeared consistently in the after-action reports. Sergeant Sarah Chen, Human Colonial Marines. When the display finally ended, the silence stretched for nearly a minute. Zexstar stared at the space where the holographic text had been. His earlier arrogance completely evaporated. His companions had backed away slightly, their body language suddenly much more respectful. It was Zexera who finally broke the silence. "You are the shield of Vega Prime," she said, her analytical voice filled with something approaching awe. "The records speak of a single human soldier who held the evacuation point for 12 hours against continuous assault. Command estimated it should have taken 50 soldiers to accomplish what you did alone." Sarah's expression didn't change, but something in her posture suggested acknowledgement. "The armor remembers," she said simply. Around them, the crowd of spectators had grown silent and respectful. These were names they knew, battles that were taught in their own military academies as examples of courage, tactical brilliance, and impossible determination. To be in the presence of someone who had actually been there, who had lived through those legendary engagements, was overwhelming. Zexstar tried to salvage some of his earlier bravado. "Records can be fabricated," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Sarah's helmet turned toward him, and for a moment the human's eyes were visible through the visor. They held an expression that made the young Zilonian take an involuntary step backward. "Would you like me to demonstrate why the records are accurate?" she asked quietly. The question was spoken without any particular emphasis, but somehow it carried more menace than any shouted threat. Several of the observing cadets actually moved away from the group, their instincts warning them that they were witnessing something dangerous. General Vexai chose that moment to make his presence known, his massive form moving through the crowd with surprising grace. The Corvin's expression was unreadable as he approached the small group at the center of the commotion. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice carrying the authority of absolute command. "No, sir," Zexstar replied quickly, his species' natural deference to authority overwhelming his earlier aggression. "We were simply discussing equipment choices." The general's gaze moved to Sarah, and again that moment of recognition passed between them. When he spoke, his words were carefully chosen. "Cadet Chen," he said formally, "welcome to the Academy. I trust you will find our facilities adequate for your needs." "Thank you, sir," Sarah replied with a crisp salute that spoke of years of military discipline. "Excellent." General Vexay's attention moved to encompass the entire crowd of spectators. "I suggest all cadets focus on their dormitory assignments and prepare for tomorrow's initial evaluations. Dismissed." The crowd began to disperse, but slowly, with many backward glances at the human in the scarred armor. Conversations buzzed with speculation and amazement. Word would spread quickly through the academy. There was a real combat veteran among the new cadets, someone who had actually fought in the legendary battles they had only read about. As Sarah gathered her gear and prepared to leave, Marcus Webb approached hesitantly. "The Shield of Vega Prime," he said, his voice filled with barely contained excitement. "You're actually her. I wrote my entrance essay about that battle, about how one soldier saved nearly 3,000 people." Sarah looked at him for a moment, seeing something of her own younger self in his eager expression. "The evacuation succeeded because everyone did their job," she said. "The transport pilots, the medical teams, the civilian volunteers who helped organize the evacuees. No one person wins a battle alone." "But the records say what happened," Sarah interrupted gently. "They don't always explain why. Tomorrow we start learning theory. Pay attention. Theory keeps people alive." With that, she walked away, her armor systems automatically mapping the route to her assigned quarters. Behind her, she could hear Marcus trying to process what he'd just been told, while other cadets whispered among themselves about the mysterious human who wore her battle scars like a badge of honor. In her quarters that night, Sarah finally allowed herself to remove the armor for the first time in days. Each piece came off with practiced efficiency, revealing the network of scars that covered her body beneath. Some were from enemy weapons, others from environmental hazards or equipment failures. All of them were reminders of lessons learned, prices paid, and battles survived. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests, and new opportunities to prove that experience counted for more than theory. The other cadets would learn, in time, what it truly meant to be a warrior. But tonight, for the first time in years, Sarah Chen allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, she could help ensure that the next generation of military leaders would never have to pay the same prices she had paid to learn their lessons. The armor stood silent in the corner, its sensors in standby mode, waiting for the next battle. The Academy's main training hall buzzed with nervous energy as 200 cadets assembled for their first practical exercise. The vast chamber could reconfigure itself into any environment imaginable: Arctic wasteland, jungle warfare scenarios, urban combat zones, or even zero-gravity conditions. Today, however, it remained in its basic configuration, a simple obstacle course designed to test physical capability and problem-solving skills. Sarah stood with the other cadets, her armor drawing continued stares and whispered conversations. Word of the previous day's revelation had spread throughout the student body like wildfire. Everyone knew who she was now, or at least, they knew the legend. Whether they believed it was another matter entirely. Commander Thexara, a stern Vorthan with elaborate carapace markings denoting high military rank, addressed the assembled students from a raised platform. Her compound eyes swept across the crowd with mechanical precision, categorizing and analyzing each cadet with the cold efficiency her species was known for. "This morning's exercise will establish baseline performance metrics," she announced, her translated voice cutting through the murmur of conversations. "You will navigate the obstacle course as quickly and efficiently as possible. Your performance will be recorded and analyzed. Those who fail to meet minimum standards will face additional training." The course itself looked deceptively simple: a series of walls to climb, barriers to cross, and puzzles to solve. But Sarah's experienced eye caught details the other cadets missed. The walls were slightly too high for most species to climb easily. The barriers required both strength and coordination to overcome. The puzzles would test not just intelligence, but decision-making under pressure. "Cadets will proceed in groups of 10, Commander Thexara continued. First group, take your positions." Zexstar pushed forward immediately, his Zolonian arrogance apparently undimmed by the previous day's encounter. His companions followed, along with several other species who clearly considered themselves among the elite. Sarah noticed that none of them looked particularly concerned about the physical challenges ahead. The first group took their positions at the starting line, preening and posturing as they waited for the signal to begin. When Commander Thexara's whistle pierced the air, they charged forward with enthusiasm that quickly turned to confusion. The first obstacle was a 3-meter wall with no obvious handholds. Zexstar leaped at it confidently, his species' natural agility allowing him to scramble partway up before his claws found no purchase on the smooth surface. He slid back down, his elegant uniform now smudged with dust, and his dignity severely dented. "Perhaps if you worked together," Commander Thexara observed dryly as the group milled around uncertainly. One of the Corvin cadets, a massive bear-like female named Grixta, immediately grasped the concept. She positioned herself against the wall and allowed the smaller species to climb over her broad shoulders, but even then, the wall proved challenging. The Zeronians were agile but lacked upper body strength. The Ethereals could float, but the course's energy-dampening field limited their abilities. Sarah watched with professional interest as the group struggled through each obstacle. Their individual skills were impressive, but they had no idea how to function as a unit. Each cadet approached every challenge as if they were competing against their teammates rather than working with them. The puzzle section proved even more revealing. Presented with a tactical scenario involving a besieged colony and limited resources, the group immediately began arguing about the correct solution. Zexstar insisted on a direct assault that would have resulted in massive casualties. A Vorthan cadet proposed a logical but slow siege approach that would have taken months. An Ethereal suggested negotiation, apparently unaware that the enemy in the scenario was a non-sentient species. After 23 minutes of confusion, bickering, and failed attempts, the first group finally crossed the finish line looking exhausted and frustrated. Their time was announced as the worst recorded in Academy history. "Second group," Commander Thexara called, her voice betraying no emotion whatsoever. Sarah found herself grouped with Marcus Webb, 3 other humans, 2 Corvan cadets, a Zolonian female who kept staring at Sarah's armor with obvious curiosity, and 2 members of a species she didn't immediately recognize. Tall, thin beings with elongated limbs and silver-scaled skin. As they approached the starting line, Sarah could feel the attention of every spectator in the hall. The other groups had performed poorly, and expectations were high for the group containing the legendary Shield of Vega Prime. "What's the plan?" asked Marcus, his voice tight with nervous energy. Sarah studied the course for a moment, her tactical mind automatically breaking it down into component challenges and optimal solutions. The physical obstacles required teamwork and communication. The puzzles demanded both analytical thinking and practical experience. Most importantly, the whole thing was designed to test leadership under pressure. "The course isn't about individual performance," she said quietly, her words intended for her team alone. "It's about working together." "Obviously," snorted the Zolonian female whose nameplate identified her as Kesarara. "But someone needs to take charge, and frankly, I don't see why that should be a human wearing outdated equipment." The 2 unidentified aliens introduced themselves as Veltar and Nixen of the Meridian Collective, a species that had only recently joined the galactic community. They spoke in harmonized tones, their words overlapping in complex patterns that their translators struggled to render accurately. "We/us suggest analysis before action," they said in unison. "Observation reveals optimal pathways." One of the Corvan cadets, a young male named Torval, flexed his massive arms confidently. "Corvan strength will overcome any physical barrier," he declared. "Simply point the way." Sarah listened to each team member express their thoughts, noting their strengths, weaknesses, and natural inclinations. This was familiar territory. She'd done this countless times before, assembling mixed-species teams under fire, getting strangers to work together when their lives depended on it. "Position yourselves," Commander Thexara announced. The whistle sounded, and Sarah's team moved forward as a coordinated unit. Where the first group had charged ahead recklessly, Sarah's team approached each obstacle methodically. At the 3-meter wall, Sarah positioned Torval as a base while directing the more agile team members to form a human ladder. "Marcus, your point. Get to the top and drop the rope. Kesara, you're next. Use your claws to secure handholds for the others." The Zolonian female looked surprised at being given a critical role, but she followed instructions efficiently. Within minutes, the entire team had scaled the wall with minimal effort and no wasted energy. The next obstacle was a pit filled with a viscous, foul-smelling liquid that had to be crossed without touching the surface. Previous groups had tried to jump it, swim through it, or find ways around it. All had failed. "Bridge," Sarah said simply, pointing to several loose planks scattered nearby. "Veltar Nixon, your species has excellent spatial reasoning. Calculate the angles. Torval, you and the other Corvan will provide the anchoring strength." Working together, the team quickly assembled an improvised bridge that spanned the pit safely. They crossed in single file, each member helping to stabilize the structure for those behind them. The watching cadets buzzed with surprised conversation. This was the same course that had stymied the first group for nearly half an hour, yet Sarah's team was moving through it like water flowing downhill. Commander Thexara observed silently, her compound eyes tracking every movement and decision. This was the first time in her tenure at the Academy that she'd seen cadets instinctively grasp the cooperative nature of military operations. The puzzle section proved equally revealing. Presented with the same tactical scenario that had paralyzed the first group, Sarah's team didn't waste time arguing about the correct solution. Instead, Sarah asked each member to contribute their species' perspective on the problem. Corvan doctrine emphasizes overwhelming force, Torval offered. Zolonian tactics favor stealth and precision strikes, Cassara added. The Meridian Collective calculates probability matrices for optimal resource allocation. Veltar and Nixon harmonized. Marcus, looking nervous but determined, said human strategy typically focuses on adaptability and rapid response to changing conditions. Sarah nodded, absorbing each input. The scenario assumes we know the enemy's capabilities and intentions. In reality, we wouldn't have that luxury. The solution isn't to find the perfect plan, it's to create a plan that can adapt when everything goes wrong. Her final answer was a hybrid approach that incorporated elements from each species' military doctrine while maintaining flexibility for unexpected developments. It wasn't the textbook solution, but it was practical and achievable with the resources available. Commander Thexara's expression remained neutral, but her antennae twitched in what those familiar with Vorthan body language recognized as surprise. The human cadet had just demonstrated a level of tactical thinking that most Academy graduates never achieved. Sarah's team crossed the finish line in 8 minutes and 37 seconds, shattering the previous course record by more than half. More importantly, they'd completed every obstacle and puzzle without a single failure or retry. The hall erupted in amazed chatter as the implications sank in. Not only had they beaten the record, they'd made it look effortless. Several instructors were already pulling up recordings of the run, analyzing the team dynamics and decision-making processes for future study. Exceptional performance, Commander Thexara announced, her voice carrying across the sudden silence. This team will serve as the baseline for future evaluations. As Sarah's team caught their breath, other cadets approached with mixtures of awe, curiosity, and barely concealed resentment. The humans looked proud but slightly overwhelmed by the attention. The alien members of the team seemed equally surprised by their own success. "How did you know?" Marcus asked breathlessly. "I mean, how did you know exactly what each of us should do?" "Experience," Sarah replied simply. "Every species has strengths. Every individual brings something different. The trick is matching capabilities to requirements." Cassara studied her with new respect. "You treated us as individuals rather than just representatives of our species," the Zolonian observed. "Most commanders assume all Zeronians are identical, that we all think and fight the same way. Assumptions get people killed," Sarah said. "In real combat, you learn fast that every being is unique, regardless of species. Cookie-cutter tactics don't work when lives are on the line." Veltar and Nixon approached with their characteristic synchronized movements. "You/Sarah demonstrated understanding of multi-species coordination," they said in their harmonized speech. "This skill is rare among young commanders. How was such experience acquired?" Before Sarah could answer, Zexstar and his group approached, their earlier smugness replaced by obvious frustration and injured pride. The Zolonian noble's uniform was now thoroughly disheveled from his team's struggles with the course, and his expression suggested he was looking for someone to blame. "Luck!" he announced loudly, clearly intending his words to carry to the growing crowd of spectators. "Anyone can have one good run. Real military leadership requires consistency over time." "Indeed," agreed one of his companions, a pompous ethereal whose family held significant political influence in their home system. "A single exercise proves nothing. Perhaps the course was somehow adjusted to favor the humans' team." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Several cadets who hadn't performed well on their own runs seemed eager to accept any explanation that didn't involve admitting they'd been outclassed by a human in outdated armor. Sarah turned to face Zexstar directly, her expression calm but her posture suggesting she was prepared for whatever might come next. The move was subtle, but those with military experience recognized the shift. She'd gone from relaxed awareness to combat readiness in the space of a heartbeat. "You're suggesting the Academy would compromise its evaluation standards?" she asked quietly. I'm suggesting, Zexstar said, stepping closer, that anyone can get lucky once. Real commanders prove themselves repeatedly, under different conditions, against varying challenges. The challenge in his voice was unmistakable. Around them, the crowd pressed closer, sensing confrontation. Even the instructors had stopped their conversations to observe the developing situation. Commander Thexara moved to intervene, but General Vexahai appeared at her side with a subtle gesture for restraint. The massive Corvan watched the proceedings with interest rather than concern. "What are you proposing?" Sarah asked. Zexstar's crest flared with satisfaction at having provoked a response. "A series of challenges, different scenarios, different conditions. Let's see how your primitive tactics hold up when the variables change. And if I decline, then everyone here will know that the famous Shield of Vega Prime was just a propaganda story designed to make humans seem more important than they actually are." The insult hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Several human cadets looked ready to respond angrily, while alien spectators watched to see how the situation would develop. Sarah's team members stood ready to support her, but this was clearly a challenge that had to be faced individually. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her tactical mind working through the implications. Zexstar was clearly hoping to provoke an emotional response, to get her to accept a challenge on his terms. It was a classic manipulation tactic, one she'd seen used by politicians and glory seekers countless times. "3 challenges," she said finally. "Your choice of scenarios, but I choose the victory conditions." Zexstar's expression showed surprise and suspicion. "What conditions?" "Success is measured by mission completion, not speed or style points. Real combat isn't about looking good, it's about achieving objectives while keeping your people alive." "Agreed," Zexstar said quickly, clearly confident that his theoretical knowledge would overcome whatever practical experience the human might possess. General Vexai stepped forward before the agreement could be formalized. "Such challenges require official sanction," he announced. "If both cadets are serious about this competition, it will be conducted under Academy supervision with proper safety protocols." "Of course," Zexstar said with a bow that barely contained his eagerness. Sarah nodded once, her expression revealing nothing of her inner thoughts. "Excellent," the general continued. "The challenges will take place tomorrow afternoon. All cadets are invited to observe." His gaze moved to Sarah. "I trust you understand what you're accepting, Cadet Shen." "Yes, sir. Very well." "Dismissed." As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah found herself surrounded by her team members and several other cadets who had been impressed by her performance. Marcus looked worried, while Kessera seemed excited by the prospect of seeing her new commander in action. "Are you sure about this?" Marcus asked quietly. "Zexstar is nobles. He's had the best training money can buy, and he's been studying theoretical warfare since he was a child." "Theory is important," Sarah agreed. "But it's not the same as experience." Torval rumbled his agreement. "Corvan warriors respect only those who have proven themselves in actual battle. This Zilonian talks much but has done little. The challenge parameters favor theoretical knowledge," Veltar and Nixon observed. "Scenarios will be designed to test academic understanding rather than practical application." Sarah appreciated their concern, but her expression remained confident. "Then I'll have to make sure the scenarios become practical very quickly." As her team dispersed to their evening assignments, Sarah remained in the training hall, studying the obstacle course and thinking about what the next day would bring. Zexstar was intelligent, well-educated, and backed by significant family resources. He would have access to extensive tactical databases and probably coaching from experienced military advisors. But Sarah had something he didn't. She knew the difference between planning a battle and surviving one. The challenges would test more than just knowledge or skill. They would reveal the fundamental difference between those who had studied war and those who had lived it. Tomorrow would be very educational for everyone involved. In her quarters that evening, Sarah ran maintenance checks on her armor while reviewing tactical scenarios in her mind. Each system reported green, just as they had every night for the past 15 years. The armor was old, scarred, and unfashionable by current standards. But it worked. It had saved her life countless times, and it carried the accumulated wisdom of 100 battles. Let Zexstar bring his theories and his pride. She would bring experience, and they would all learn which was more valuable when the shooting started. The Academy's main combat simulation chamber hummed with energy as technicians made final preparations for the unprecedented challenge match. Word had spread beyond the cadet corps, and the observation galleries were packed with instructors, senior staff, and even several visiting dignitaries from various military commands. This wasn't just a contest between two students anymore. It had become a demonstration that could influence military thinking across multiple species. Sarah stood in the preparation area, running final diagnostics on her armor systems. Everything showed green just as it had every morning for the past 15 years. Across the chamber, Zexstar held court with a group of supporters, his voice carrying clearly as he explained the theoretical frameworks he planned to employ. The human relies on outdated tactics, he was saying, his translator rendering his words with perfect clarity. Modern warfare requires sophisticated strategic thinking, not primitive aggression. These challenges will demonstrate the superiority of proper military education. General Vekshai observed from the primary observation deck, flanked by Commander Thexara and several other senior officers. The massive Corbin's expression was unreadable, but his presence alone indicated the importance being placed on this event. First scenario loading, announced the chamber's AI in multiple languages. Urban warfare simulation. Objective: secure the communications hub and establish defensive perimeter. Enemy forces, mixed opposition with varied capabilities. Duration: 30 minutes maximum. The chamber floor shimmered and transformed, creating a detailed cityscape complete with damaged buildings, blocked streets, and simulated civilian populations. The attention to detail was remarkable. Even the ambient sounds of a war-torn city filled the air. Zexstar entered the simulation first, his pristine uniform gleaming under the artificial sunlight. He moved with confidence, immediately accessing the scenario's tactical display and beginning what appeared to be a thorough analysis of the situation. His supporters nodded approvingly as he began issuing orders to his simulated troops, positioning them according to standard Academy doctrine. The Zolonian's approach was textbook perfect. He established a command post with proper communication protocols, deployed reconnaissance elements to gather intelligence, and organized his forces into efficient tactical units. His movements were precise, his decisions logical, and his adherence to established military procedure flawless. For the first 10 minutes, everything went according to plan. Zexstar's forces advanced methodically, securing key positions and establishing overlapping fields of fire. His commentary, transmitted to the observation galleries for educational purposes, demonstrated extensive knowledge of urban warfare theory. Note the proper use of reconnaissance elements he explained as his virtual soldiers moved through the simulated streets. Intelligence gathering is paramount in urban environments. Once we have identified enemy positions, we can apply appropriate tactical responses. The watching cadets took notes furiously. This was military science at its finest, executed with precision and confidence. Several instructors nodded approvingly at the demonstration of Academy training principles. Then the simulation's AI began adapting to Zexstar's tactics. The first hint of trouble came when his reconnaissance team reported enemy positions that didn't match the initial intelligence briefing. Zexstar paused, clearly puzzled by the discrepancy. In theoretical scenarios, enemy forces typically behaved according to predictable patterns, but the AI running this simulation had been programmed with combat data from actual urban warfare engagements, including many of the battles Sarah had fought in. "Adjust formation," Zexstar ordered, his confidence beginning to show cracks. "Redirect second squad to investigate the anomaly." The enemy responded by abandoning their positions entirely and melting into the civilian population. Zexstar's carefully planned assault suddenly found itself attacking empty buildings while taking fire from unexpected directions. His troops began requesting new orders as their original instructions became obsolete. "Adapt to changing conditions," Zexstar muttered, accessing his tactical database for alternative strategies. but the scenario continued evolving faster than he could adjust to it. Enemy forces appeared and disappeared like ghosts, striking at weak points in his formation before vanishing again. By the 20-minute mark, Zextar's methodical advance had stalled completely. His troops were pinned down in 3 different locations, his communication lines were under constant harassment, and his original objective seemed impossibly distant. The textbook tactics that had worked perfectly in classroom scenarios were proving inadequate against an enemy that refused to behave according to theoretical models. "Time!" announced the AI as the 30-minute limit expired. Scenario incomplete. Mission failure. Zextar emerged from the simulation chamber looking shaken and confused. His supporters gathered around him with consoling words and explanations about the scenario's unfairness, but their enthusiasm had clearly diminished. "Second challenge," General Vexai announced. "Cadet Chen, prepare for insertion." Sarah stepped into the simulation chamber as the environment reset itself. The same urban landscape materialized around her, complete with identical enemy forces and objectives. But from the moment she entered the scenario, her approach was fundamentally different. Where Zextar had immediately sought high ground for a command overview, Sarah moved directly into the city streets. Her armor sensors cataloged potential threats, escape routes, and defensive positions as she advanced. There was no dramatic planning phase, no lengthy intelligence gathering, just smooth, efficient movement toward the objective. "Interesting, Commander," Thexara observed from the gallery. "She's not following standard protocol." "No," General Vexai agreed quietly. "She's treating this like a real battle." Sarah's first contact with enemy forces came within minutes of entering the scenario. But instead of trying to eliminate them according to theoretical doctrine, she simply noted their positions and continued moving. When they opened fire, she used her armor's defensive systems and the urban terrain to avoid engagement entirely. "Why isn't she fighting back?" asked one of the watching cadets. "Because fighting isn't always the objective," replied an instructor who had actual combat experience. "Sometimes you accomplish more by avoiding unnecessary engagements." Sarah's route through the city was erratic and seemingly random, but it consistently avoided the major enemy concentrations while moving steadily toward her target. When forced to engage, her response was swift and efficient, just enough force to neutralize immediate threats before disengaging and continuing her advance. The watching cadets began to understand that they were seeing something entirely different from Zextar's methodical approach. Where the Zilonian had tried to control the entire battlefield, Sarah was focused exclusively on her mission objective. Where he had sought to eliminate enemy forces, she was simply bypassing them whenever possible. "She's not playing the same game," Veltar and Nixon observed in their harmonized voices. "Her victory conditions are different." 15 minutes into the scenario, Sarah reached the communications hub that Zextar had never even approached. But instead of immediately securing it according to standard procedure, she spent several minutes observing the enemy forces protecting it. Only when she was satisfied with her assessment did she move into action. Her assault on the hub was unlike anything taught in academy classrooms. There was no preliminary bombardment, no careful positioning of support elements, no attempt to establish fire superiority. Instead, she simply moved through the enemy defenses like they weren't there, using her armor systems and her intimate knowledge of urban combat to neutralize threats faster than they could respond. The enemy's reaction was swift and professional, but they were responding to tactics they didn't understand. Every time they attempted to pin her down, she was already moving to a new position. Every time they concentrated forces to counter her, she had already shifted her approach. "How is she doing this?" Zextar demanded from the observation gallery. "She's not following any recognized tactical doctrine." "No," agreed General Vexai. "She's improvising based on real-world experience. The AI is trying to adapt to her tactics, but she's changing faster than it can analyze her patterns." 22 minutes into the scenario, Sarah had secured the communications hub and established a defensive perimeter that incorporated elements the simulation designers hadn't even considered. Instead of holding static positions like conventional doctrine demanded, she had created a fluid defense that could adapt to enemy movements while maintaining control of the objective. Scenario complete, the AI announced. All objectives achieved with minimal casualties and optimal resource utilization. When Sarah emerged from the simulation chamber, the observation galleries erupted in discussion. What they had just witnessed challenged fundamental assumptions about military tactics and strategic thinking. The same scenario that had defeated Zexstar completely had been solved by the human in less than 2/3 of the allotted time. That was impossible, one of the watching instructors muttered. No single combatant should be able to achieve those results against that level of opposition. Unless, Commander Thexara replied thoughtfully, they had experience with situations where impossible results were the only option for survival. Zexstar's supporters were notably quiet as preparations began for the second challenge. The Zolonian himself looked confused and frustrated, clearly struggling to understand how his superior theoretical knowledge had proven so inadequate. Second scenario loading, the AI announced. Spaceboarding action. Objective: capture enemy vessel while minimizing damage to critical systems. Opposition: entrenched defenders with superior numbers. Duration: 20 minutes maximum. This time, Zexstar insisted on reviewing the tactical parameters before entering the simulation. He spent nearly 10 minutes analyzing ship layouts, defensive positions, and equipment specifications before formulating his approach. His plan, when he finally explained it to his supporters, was comprehensive and methodical. Boarding actions require careful coordination, he explained confidently. We'll establish multiple entry points, divide enemy attention, and advance systematically through each deck. Standard procedure adapted for shipboard operations. His execution was as flawless as his planning. Zexstar's simulated boarding party moved through the enemy vessel with textbook precision, clearing each compartment methodically and maintaining constant communication. His knowledge of ship systems and defensive tactics was impressive, and for the first several minutes it appeared he might actually succeed. But once again, the simulation's adaptive AI began responding to his predictable tactics. Enemy forces that should have been eliminated reappeared in supposedly cleared sections. Critical systems that should have been easily captured turned out to be booby-trapped. Worst of all, the systematic advance that looked so efficient in theory proved catastrophically slow when every minute allowed the enemy more time to prepare their defenses. Adapt the timeline, Zexstar ordered as his careful schedule began falling apart. Accelerate the advance. But acceleration meant abandoning the methodical approach that was the foundation of his entire strategy. His forces began making mistakes, missing threats they would have caught with proper procedure. Casualties mounted as corners were cut to make up for lost time. Time expires, the AI announced with 3 decks still unsecured. Mission failure. Enemy vessel has initiated self-destruct sequence. Zexstar emerged from the simulation looking defeated. The murmur from the observation galleries was sympathetic but tinged with disappointment. This was the second scenario where academy training had proven inadequate against adaptive opposition. Sarah's approach to the same challenge was radically different from the beginning. Instead of analyzing the ship's layout in detail, she spent her preparation time studying the enemy's psychology and probable reactions. When she finally entered the simulation, her movement was immediate and decisive. Rather than establishing multiple entry points as doctrine suggested, Sarah chose a single point of access that appeared heavily defended. The watching cadets gasped as her armored figure plunged directly into what looked like a suicidal assault on the enemy's strongest position. "She's going to get herself killed," someone whispered. "Watch," General Vexhai commanded quietly. Sarah's assault on the defended entry point was swift and brutal, but it served a purpose beyond simple combat effectiveness. By attacking their strongest position directly, she forced the enemy to commit their reserves and reveal their defensive strategy. More importantly, her obvious route of attack drew defenders away from the areas she actually intended to capture. While enemy forces concentrated on repelling her frontal assault, Sarah was already moving through the ship's maintenance conduits and service passages that didn't appear on standard tactical displays. Her armor's sensors had mapped these routes during her initial approach, identifying pathways that led directly to the vessel's critical systems. "She's not fighting for territory," Commander Thexara realized. She's targeting the enemy's ability to resist. Sarah's real targets were the ship's environmental systems, power distribution networks, and communication arrays. Instead of fighting through defended corridors to reach the bridge, she simply disabled the systems that allowed the defenders to coordinate their resistance. By the time the enemy realized what was happening, they were fighting blind in the dark while breathing increasingly stale air. "Brilliant," breathed one of the watching instructors. "She's treating the ship itself as her primary weapon." The enemy's organized defense collapsed within minutes of losing their life support and communication systems. Demoralized and disoriented, they surrendered rather than continue fighting in impossible conditions. Sarah had captured the entire vessel without firing more than a few shots, and the critical systems Zek-Star had worried about protecting were completely undamaged.
"Scenario complete," the AI announced.
All objectives achieved. Total time, 11 minutes, 43 seconds. The silence from the observation galleries was profound. What they had just witnessed wasn't just tactical innovation, it was a fundamental rethinking of how space combat should be approached. Instead of fighting the enemy's strengths, Sarah had simply eliminated their ability to employ those strengths effectively. "One more scenario," Zek-Star said desperately as Sarah emerged from the simulation chamber. The terms were 3 challenges. "Indeed," General Vex-High agreed. "Final scenario loading." "Ground assault," the AI announced. "Objective: eliminate enemy fortified position while protecting nearby civilian settlement. Opposition: heavy defenses with artillery support. Duration: 45 minutes maximum." This time, Zek-Star barely bothered with detailed planning. His confidence had been shattered by 2 consecutive failures, and his movements in the simulation were tentative and uncertain. He attempted to combine elements from both his previous approaches, but without the certainty that had driven his earlier efforts. The result was predictably disastrous. Zek-Star's forces advanced without clear objectives, retreated when faced with serious opposition, and ultimately spent most of their allotted time maneuvering without achieving anything significant. When the timer expired, the enemy fortification remained intact and the civilian settlement was under bombardment. "Mission failure," the AI announced unnecessarily. Sarah's final demonstration was her most educational yet. Faced with a heavily fortified position that couldn't be bypassed and a civilian population that couldn't be moved, she chose a solution that no academy textbook would have recommended. She negotiated. "What is she doing?" asked a confused cadet as Sarah's armored figure approached the enemy fortification under a flag of truce. "Something that never occurs to most military planners," General Vex-High replied. "She's talking to them." Sarah's conversation with the simulated enemy commander lasted less than 5 minutes, but the result was immediate and decisive. The enemy forces abandoned their fortified position and withdrew, leaving the civilian settlement unharmed and the objective achieved without a single casualty. "How?" Zek-Star demanded when Sarah emerged from the simulation. "What could you possibly have offered them?" "Information," Sarah replied simply. "I told them what was going to happen to their position if they stayed and offered them a chance to leave with their lives and honor intact." "But the AI was programmed to resist," protested one of the instructors. "The scenario assumed enemy forces would fight to the death." "Most beings prefer survival to pointless sacrifice," Sarah explained. The AI was sophisticated enough to accept a logical alternative when one was offered. General Vex-High stepped forward to address the assembled crowd. "These demonstrations have been highly educational," he announced. "They highlight the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical application, between fighting the war you've studied and adapting to the war you're actually in." The massive Corvin's gaze moved to encompass all the watching cadets. Excellence in military command requires both elements. Theory provides the foundation, but experience teaches flexibility. Today, we have seen what happens when adaptability meets rigid doctrine. Zek-Star stood in stunned silence, his worldview fundamentally challenged by what he had witnessed. His supporters had long since abandoned him, drawn to the undeniable effectiveness of Sarah's approaches. Around the chamber, cadets and instructors buzzed with excited conversation about tactics, strategy, and the nature of military leadership. Cadet Shen, General Vexahai continued, your performance today will be analyzed and incorporated into Academy curriculum. Your practical insights may help future officers avoid the mistakes that cost lives in real combat. Sarah nodded acknowledgement, but her expression remained modest. Every battle teaches something different, sir. These were just scenarios. Real combat is always more complicated. Indeed, the general agreed, which is why experience is so valuable. Dismissed. As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah found herself surrounded by cadets eager to learn from her demonstrations. Marcus looked proud and excited, while her other team members seemed eager to discuss what they had witnessed. How did you know the AI would accept your negotiation? Asked Kisara. I didn't, Sarah admitted, but it was worth trying. In real combat, you explore every option before resorting to violence. Sometimes the enemy is just as tired of fighting as you are. That's not what they teach us in strategy class, observed Torval. Strategy classes assume perfect information and rational actors, Sarah replied. Reality is messier than that. Good commanders learn to work with incomplete data and unpredictable opponents. Veltar and Nixon approached with their characteristic synchronized movements. You/Sarah demonstrated principles not found in standard tactical databases, they observed. Where do such concepts originate? Experience. 15 years of colonial warfare taught me that every situation is unique, every enemy is different, and every victory comes with a price. The trick is making sure the price is worth paying. As the conversations continued around her, Sarah noticed Zexstar standing alone near the simulation chamber entrance. The young Zolonian looked lost and confused, his earlier arrogance replaced by uncertainty and self-doubt. Against her better judgment, Sarah approached him. You have good tactical knowledge, she said quietly. Your planning was thorough and your execution was textbook perfect. Zexstar looked up at her with surprise. But it wasn't enough. You made it look easy. It wasn't easy, Sarah corrected. It just looked different because my objectives were different. You were trying to fight perfect battles. I was trying to complete missions. I don't understand the difference. Sarah studied him for a moment, seeing something of her own younger self in his confusion. Perfect battles exist only in theory. Real combat is about achieving objectives with whatever resources you have available, against an enemy who doesn't follow the rules you've studied.
But how do you learn that without... Zexstar gestured helplessly.
Without getting people killed while you figure it out? Sarah finished. You listen to those who have been there. You study real battles, not just theoretical ones. And you remember that your job isn't to be brilliant, it's to bring your people home alive. Zexstar was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with concepts that challenged everything he had believed about military leadership. Finally, he asked, Would you be willing to teach us? Some of us want to learn. Sarah looked around the chamber at the eager faces of cadets from a dozen different species, all waiting to hear her answer. These young beings would someday command fleets, defend worlds, and make decisions that affected billions of lives. They deserved to learn from more than just textbooks and simulations. Theory is important, she said finally, but it's not enough. If you want to learn about real combat, about leading beings in impossible situations, about making decisions when lives hang in the balance, then yes, I'll teach you what I can. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Cadets pressed forward with questions, requests, and expressions of gratitude. For the first time since arriving at the academy, Sarah felt that perhaps her experiences might serve a purpose beyond her own survival. She was no longer just a veteran trying to fit into an academic environment. She was a teacher, passing on hard-won wisdom to the next generation of military leaders. And perhaps, if she did her job well enough, some of them might never have to pay the same prices she had paid to learn their lessons. 3 months had passed since the challenge that had fundamentally changed the dynamic at the Galactic Military Academy. What had begun as a demonstration of practical versus theoretical knowledge had evolved into something far more significant. Sarah Chen had become the Academy's most sought-after unofficial instructor, and her scarred armor was no longer a subject of mockery but a symbol of hard-earned wisdom. The evening training sessions she conducted in the auxiliary combat chambers had grown from a handful of curious cadets to nearly half the student body. Species that had never cooperated were working together, sharing tactical insights that merged their unique capabilities with practical combat experience. The Academy's formal curriculum remained unchanged, but the real learning was happening after hours. Tonight's session was different. General Vaiksai himself had requested to observe, along with several other senior officers whose presence suggested this was more than routine evaluation. Sarah had spent the afternoon reviewing the lesson plan she'd developed, knowing that tonight's performance could determine whether her unofficial teaching would be formalized or forbidden. The auxiliary chamber had been configured as a multi-environment training space with sections representing urban warfare, space combat, and wilderness survival scenarios. 47 cadets from 11 different species waited in organized formation, their earlier skepticism replaced by genuine respect and anticipation. Tonight we're going to discuss the hardest lesson any military leader learns, Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustics. How to make decisions when there are no good options available. She gestured to the urban warfare section where holographic buildings displayed the scars of prolonged conflict. 12 hours to get 2,700 civilians off-world before the planet was glassed by enemy forces. Standard evacuation protocols called for systematic processing, identification verification, and orderly boarding procedures. Marcus Webb raised his hand. But that would have taken days, not hours. Following procedure would have killed everyone. Sarah's expression grew distant as she accessed memories she rarely shared. So we made a choice. We loaded civilians onto transports without checking identification, without screening for security threats, without following any of the protocols designed to keep us safe. The chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. Several cadets looked uncomfortable with the idea of abandoning established procedures, while others nodded with growing understanding. "What happened?" asked Kesara, the Zalonian female who had become one of Sarah's most dedicated students. "We saved 2,643 civilians," Sarah replied. 57 died in the evacuation itself, transport accidents, panic-related casualties, a few who couldn't be reached in time, but we got the rest off-world before the bombardment began. "That's a 97% success rate," observed Veltar and Nixon in their harmonized speech. "Most tactical analyses would consider such results highly effective." Sarah's expression darkened. Tactical analyses don't account for what we found afterward. Among the evacuees were 3 enemy agents who had been placed in the civilian population months earlier. Because we skipped security screening, they made it onto the evacuation ships. The silence stretched as cadets began to understand the complexity of the situation. Torval, the Corvan cadet who had become one of Sarah's most reliable students, spoke slowly. "The enemy agents caused additional casualties?" "They destroyed 2 transports during the evacuation flight," Sarah confirmed. 412 people died because of my decision to prioritize speed over security. People who had survived the bombardment, who thought they were safe, who died because I chose to save time instead of following procedure. The weight of that admission settled over the chamber like a physical presence. These cadets had studied military theory for years, analyzing battles and strategies as abstract problems with clear solutions. But Sarah was describing the reality of command decisions made with incomplete information, where every choice carried a terrible price. "So you were wrong to skip security screening?" asked a young ethereal cadet whose translucent form flickered with nervous energy. "No," Sarah said firmly. "I was wrong to think there was a right answer. If we'd followed security protocols, everyone would have died in the bombardment. If we'd been more thorough in our evacuation procedures, we might have caught the enemy agents but lost thousands more to the time delay." She moved to stand before a holographic display showing the tactical situation at Vega Prime, enemy fleets approaching, civilian transports loading desperately, time running out with each passing minute. It's about making the best decision you can with the information available, accepting the consequences, and living with the results. Every choice has a cost. Every victory comes with a price. The question isn't whether people will die, it's how many, and whether their sacrifice achieves something worth the price paid. Zexstar, who had become one of her most attentive students since his humiliation months earlier, raised his hand hesitantly. How do you carry that burden? Knowing that your decisions led to deaths? Sarah studied him for a moment, noting how the young Zolonian had changed over the past months. His arrogance had been replaced by genuine humility, his theoretical knowledge tempered by growing understanding of practical realities. You carry it by remembering why you made the choice, she said finally, by honoring the sacrifice through continued service, by learning from the cost and making better decisions in the future, and by never, ever letting yourself become comfortable with the price of command. She activated the chamber's main display, showing a tactical scenario that made several cadets gasp in recognition. It was the Battle of Haven Colony, one of the most studied engagements in recent military history. The colony's desperate last stand against overwhelming odds had become legend, but seeing the actual tactical situation was sobering. Haven Colony, Sarah announced. 72-day siege, 15,000 civilians, 800 colonial marines against a hive fleet that should have overwhelmed us in hours. We held because we made choices that no textbook would recommend. The display showed the colony's defensive positions, clearly inadequate for the forces arrayed against them. Enemy numbers were marked in red, showing wave after wave of attacks that should have broken any reasonable defense. On day 37, the enemy breached our outer perimeter, Sarah continued, her voice taking on the flat tone of someone reciting traumatic memories. Standard doctrine called for falling back to secondary positions, establishing a new defensive line. But our secondary positions couldn't cover the civilian shelters. She highlighted areas on the tactical display where retreat routes would have exposed the colony's non-combatants to enemy fire. So we didn't retreat. We held the outer perimeter with whatever we had left. 53 Marines against 3,000 enemy soldiers. We held for 6 hours until reinforcements could establish the new line. That's impossible, whispered one of the cadets. 53 against 3,000? It was impossible, Sarah agreed, which is why it worked. The enemy expected us to retreat according to doctrine. They weren't prepared for a force that stayed in position and kept fighting when any rational commander would have withdrawn. The display shifted to show casualty figures that made several students gasp. Of the 53 Marines who held the line, only 8 survived. The price of those 6 hours had been devastating, but it had saved the civilian shelters and allowed the colony's defense to continue. I was one of the 8, Sarah said quietly. I lived because Sergeant Martinez threw himself on an enemy grenade that would have killed me. I lived because Corporal Johnson held a breach single-handedly while I evacuated wounded. I lived because 45 people made the choice to die so that others could continue fighting. The chamber was completely silent now. Several cadets looked pale as they processed the reality behind the legendary battle they had studied. The tactical brilliance they had admired was built on individual acts of sacrifice that no strategy textbook could adequately describe. Command means accepting responsibility for those sacrifices, Sarah continued. It means knowing that your decisions will cost lives and making them anyway because the alternative is worse. It means carrying the names and faces of everyone who died following your orders. She deactivated the display and moved to stand directly in front of the assembled cadets. You've been studying warfare as an academic subject, she said, analyzing tactics and strategies like mathematical problems with optimal solutions. But war isn't mathematics. It's about beings making impossible choices in terrible circumstances, trying to achieve objectives that matter more than their own survival. Marcus raised his hand slowly. How do you prepare for that kind of responsibility? You don't, Sarah replied honestly. You can study tactics and logistics and strategic theory, and you should. Knowledge saves lives when it's applied properly. But you can't prepare for the moment when you have to order someone to die for a cause you believe in. You can only hope that when the moment comes, you'll have the strength to do what needs to be done. General Vexguy chose that moment to step forward from his observation position, his massive Corvin frame commanding immediate attention from every being in the chamber. Cadet Shen raises important points that are often overlooked in formal military education, he announced, his voice carrying across the sudden silence. Theory provides the foundation for tactical thinking, but experience teaches the human cost of command decisions. The general's gaze swept across the assembled students, noting their expressions of concentration and concern. The Academy has decided to incorporate practical combat instruction into our curriculum, he continued. Cadet Chen will be formally appointed as an instructor specializing in applied tactics and command psychology. Her experiences will become part of your official education rather than supplemental training. The announcement sparked excited murmurs among the cadets. What had begun as informal after-hours instruction would now carry the full authority of the Academy's prestigious name. However, General Vexguy continued, his tone becoming more serious, this instruction will come with requirements not found in traditional coursework. You will be exposed to scenarios based on actual combat engagements. You will be forced to make decisions with incomplete information under extreme pressure. Some of you will discover that you are not suited for military command under such circumstances. He paused to let that warning sink in before continuing. Those who choose to continue with this advanced instruction will graduate with qualifications no other military academy in the galaxy can provide. You will understand not just how to plan battles, but how to lead beings in combat when plans fail and adaptation becomes the only path to survival. Sarah stepped forward. Sir, with respect, I should mention that this type of instruction can be challenging for students. The scenarios we'll cover are based on real events where real beings died. Some of the lessons may be difficult to process. All the more reason to learn them here, the general replied. Better to confront these realities in simulation than to discover them during actual combat when lives depend on immediate decisions. He turned to address the cadets directly. Participation in Instructor Chen's advanced program is voluntary. Those who choose to continue should understand that you will be held to higher standards than conventional academy coursework. You will be expected to demonstrate not just knowledge, but wisdom, not just tactical skill, but moral courage. The general's expression softened slightly as he continued. You will also gain something that no amount of theoretical study can provide. Understanding of what it truly means to serve others, to accept responsibility for their lives and deaths, to carry the weight of command with honor, and Torval was the first to step forward. I request permission to continue with the advanced instruction, sir. Granted, the general replied. One by one, the other cadets stepped forward, each requesting permission to continue. Not all were accepted. Several were quietly advised to complete more traditional coursework before attempting Sarah's advanced scenarios. But the majority were approved for continued instruction, their eagerness to learn balanced against their demonstrated maturity. When the selection process was complete, 32 cadets from 9 different species had been accepted into what would become known as the Academy's Combat Leadership Program. They represented the best and brightest of their respective militaries, young beings who would someday command fleets and make decisions affecting entire star systems. Your first advanced scenario will be next week, Sarah announced to the selected group. You'll be dealing with a multi-species evacuation under enemy fire based on the Centauri Station incident. You'll be working in mixed teams with incomplete intelligence and limited resources. What's the objective? Asked Cassara. Sarah's expression grew serious. Save as many people as possible while accomplishing the mission. Just like always. And the victory conditions? Survival, Sarah replied simply. For you, for your team, and for as many civilians as you can manage to evacuate. There are no perfect solutions, no optimal strategies that save everyone. You'll have to choose who lives and who dies, and you'll have to live with those choices. The sobering reality of that statement settled over the group like a weight. These were no longer academic exercises or theoretical problems. They were preparation for the kind of decisions that defined military careers and haunted commanders for the rest of their lives. As the cadets dispersed to their quarters, several lingered to speak with Sarah privately. Their questions revealed growing understanding of the burden she carried and growing respect for her willingness to share that burden with them. Marcus was the last to leave, his expression thoughtful and troubled. "Instructor Chen," he said formally, though they had become friends over the past months, "do you ever regret choosing military service?" Knowing what it costs? Sarah considered the question carefully. It was one she had asked herself countless times during the dark hours when memories of fallen comrades made sleep impossible. "Every day," she said honestly, "but regret isn't the same as wishing I'd made different choices." The colonies needed defenders. Civilians needed protection. Someone had to stand in the gap between civilization